Okay, so hello there, Year 10. I'm just going to do a really quick run through of how you need to approach lesson 3 of your Romeo and Juliet work this week. So this is a lesson where you have these 6 questions at the bottom here, and you need to answer them about the 5 bold quotes from your quote list. So as you can see, out of these 12 quotes, 5 of them are in bold, 3 from Act 1, 2 from Act 2, and you need to answer all 6 questions about all 5 of them. So that's 30 answers total, just to make that super clear. Now, just on a really practical level, my advice to you would be to approach this by copying and pasting the 6 questions right at the top of your document and then pasting the quotes underneath. So everything's on one page. You don't have to keep flip-flopping between documents. Obviously, if you're typing directly into show my homework, you can also paste them there. I'm just going to show you this with a Word doc. This is how I would approach it. Now, you need to answer all 6 questions in full sentences, and that is important. 1, because it's just so helpful to actually practice writing up your ideas the way you're going to write them in an essay and in the exam. And 2, it makes it much more useful as a revision resource to be able to just see your thoughts kind of coherent and clear, rather than as sort of fragments or bullet points that you can't quite understand when there's been a significant amount of time between you writing them and you reading them. So we're going to write in full sentences. Use numbers to help you write, and let's actually just go through what each of these questions is asking you to do. I'm not going to type out answers to all 6, but I will at least sort of give you some prompts of the sort of thinking we want you to do. So question 1 is asking you, what does this quote tell us about the character who is speaking? So let's actually go to the quote now. Quote number 1. What, drawn and talk of peace, I hate the word as I hate hell, all Montagues and thee. So this comes from Act 1, Scene 1, which is where a fight breaks out between the Montagues and the Capulets. And you should know by now from previous lessons that this is said by Tybalt, okay, who is a Capulet and therefore a relative of Juliet, and he's addressing Benvolio, who is a Montague and therefore a cousin of Romeo. So he's saying, you have your sword drawn, and yet you talk of peace. Well, I hate peace as much as I hate hell, your whole family, and you. So it's not particularly complicated in terms of the Shakespearean language, but that's essentially a sort of translation. What does this tell us about the character who is speaking? Well, this reveals that Tybalt is, and you should write out the name of the character as well, instead of just putting the character. Well, what does it reveal that Tybalt is? If you hate peace, what does that suggest about you? It suggests you love violence, war, conflict. It suggests that you don't want an end to the feud, to the suffering, to the loss of life. The fact that he compares it to hell, this is quite over the top. This is what we might call hyperbole. Hell, we would generally place an antithesis to peace. That is, we would view it as an opposite, because it's a place of eternal suffering. But for him, he's conflating peace and hell. So peace for him would be a sort of punishment. So I would sum that sort of thought up by saying that this reveals that Tybalt is quick-tempered and has a violent disposition. That means that violence is in his nature. His conflation of peace with hell suggests that for him, an end to the violent feud with the Montagues would be, in a sense, a punishment. Okay, so I've just written up those thoughts in full sentences, 1 or 2 sentences. You don't need to write paragraphs and paragraphs unless you really want to. And I've addressed more than one part of the quote as well. Okay, so that's question 1. I think that's relatively straightforward. Questions 2 and 3 ask you to link this quote to other characters and then to other parts of the play. Now, just quickly, thinking about the sort of essays you write about Romeo and Juliet, this is asking you to do some medium picture thinking, okay? So you take a step back from the quote and think about its significance in terms of the rest of the play. Now, in terms of question 2, I'd be asking myself 2 questions. Which character is this quote being said to? So who's being addressed, and what characters are being talked about? Now, we know he's talking to Benvolio, so I would definitely make sure, I don't know why my font's changed there, but we'll just leave that. So he's addressing Benvolio. Now, Benvolio's name literally means of goodwill, think about a word like benevolent, for example. So he's trying to do something good here by suggesting peace, and it's absolutely spat back in his face. It doesn't work. A fight breaks out. So that's definitely something we could bring up here, that Benvolio's attempt to kind of quell the violence that simmers under the surface of this play fails early on, and sort of then that continues. Peace continues to fail throughout the play. And then other characters that are talked about, I mean, the whole of the Montagues are talked about here. So the sort of core of hatred at the centre of this feud is mentioned. So that's obviously not me giving an example of a sentence, but just kind of noting down the characters I might talk about. And in terms of other parts of the play, other moments of violence, so the murder of Mercutio, the subsequent murder of Tybalt, and the deaths, of course, of Romeo and Juliet in the final act. So any other instance of violence or this kind of hatred coming to a very desperate end is relevant to this line. It should also be brought up here that violence not only underscores so many moments in the play, but also the language of the characters throughout, which really adds to that sense of the characters being star-crossed and sort of fated for that violent end, to quote the friar. So any other parts of the play that deal with that sense of violence would be useful here. Again, I must stress, this is not me writing up the kind of sentences you should answer with, this is the right kind of thing to write. This is just me giving you some kind of rough notes of the sort of things I'd be thinking about. Now, the reason I've paired question 4 and 5 together is these are kind of big picture questions where we take another step back and think about the overarching themes of the play and Shakespeare's big ideas. Now, it asks you, how is this quote relevant to the theme you placed it under on your grid? So this is the grid we're talking about. You should all have this much more filled in than I do. And in fact, if you look, you can actually see this quote has been popped in there for you under the conflict, feud and violence theme. So very straightforward. How is this quote relevant to the theme of conflict, feud and violence? And then question 5, what big ideas about that theme does it suggest? So what does it tell us about conflict, feud and violence? Does it tell us that violence is inescapable because the suggestion of peace is completely ignored? Does it tell us that conflict stems from a kind of irrational and almost blind hatred? This is just me asking questions that you might disagree, in which case brilliant. You also need to think about what other themes you might have put the quote under. So for example, does this contention really say something about Tybalt's gender? Does he perhaps detest peace because he conflates it with femininity? I don't know, you tell me. Does it tell us anything about power and powerlessness, or even male relationships? So don't just assume that you can only put it under one theme. So that's question 4 and 5, and then question 6, in the kind of opposite order that we might actually approach it in, that we would actually approach it in the exam, asks you to do a bit of small picture analysis. So you zoom in on the quote and you unpick the language and the structure of the quote, and indeed of the text around the quote. So let's think, what can we say about the language here? I think something that's really important is the monosyllables. What drawn and talk of peace, I hate the word as I hate hell. In fact, the only word in this quote that's not a monosyllable is Montague's. So what does that suggest? Well, it might suggest a mind that's quite sort of simple and really dominated by one thought. It doesn't suggest deep, complex, kind of philosophical or poetic wanderings. This is speech that is simply designed for action. It's designed, it kind of is in itself, the way it sounds, quite violent. And what adds to that actually is the caesura, which is where a poetic line is disrupted by punctuation. So you've got these thudding monosyllables and then these staccato caesura. So by staccato, I mean a kind of punchy, thuddy sound that's created by all of this pausing. I don't know why I can't type the number 6. Okay, so the, actually, I'm going to say Shakespeare's use of monosyllables and caesura lends these lines a thudding, staccato rhythm. they sound as violent as the character speaking them. So this kind of adds to the sense of violence being inescapable. It's in the very language that the characters are using to communicate. Now, what other techniques and ideas can we get from the language here? So I hate the word as I hate hell. You can hear it there as I'm saying it. There is alliteration and also repetition of the word hate. So the repetition of the word hate. Now, what does repetition do? Well, often it's all about emphasis. So I'm going to say that really emphasises the intensity of Tybalt's feelings of anger towards the Montagues. Also, I'm just going to add a connective. Furthermore, the alliteration in hate hell, sort of, you can almost hear a kind of breathiness that suggests strong emotion or physical activity. The alliteration hate hell lends the lines, I've already used that expression, creates a breathiness that suggests rage and physical exertion. Of course we've got a simile. I hate the word as I hate hell. This word as is telling me that it's a simile, not a metaphor. But not only is it a simile, we've got this triplet structure. Hell, all Montagues, and thee. So I'm going to combine those two things together in Tybalt's simile. Now, the rule of three, the triplet structure, is often something that we see in persuasive writing, so it can really lend a kind of certainty and power and a sort of convincing quality to somebody's speech. So I'm going to basically write those ideas up there. So the triplet structure in Tybalt's exaggerated simile adds a rhetorical weight and certainty to his hate-filled pronouncements. Now that is obviously a very detailed answer to question 6. We've made a lot out of a little. You know, our analysis is so much longer than the quote itself. We've unpicked several different techniques. We've thought about how that adds to the characterization of Tybalt, how it adds to the theme, to the action. We're not just saying, oh look, I can actually see, I don't know, alliteration. We've thought more about the context of the quote, and then we've worked backwards and thought about how that adds to the breathiness, the anger, the rage that's really happening here. So I've written 2 out properly and sort of prompted you of the kind of thinking we want for the others. So we've got 6, imagine we've got 6 completely thoroughly answered questions that they all look like this one or this one. Then what you're going to do is go back to the main documents, Control C, Control V, paste the next quote, and then you're going to write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 underneath it and answer it like that. Okay? Any questions, you must just message your teacher on Show My Homework. I hope that's made it a bit clearer and kind of given you some ideas of the sort of thinking we want you to do. Don't forget to have your quote grid up because you'll need that for questions 4 and 5. All right, well, enjoy year 10.